Machu Picchu is the most impressive living testimony of Inca civilization.
What we don't see is that 60% is underground. It's absolutely breathtaking.
When researchers scanned beneath Machu Picchu, they expected another empty cavity. What they found was a hidden chamber with a second room hidden inside it.
Look at that. There we go. Who's that? That could be one of them. Yeah, it looks like it's on a bit of a terrace.
At first, it looked ordinary, but then they saw the marks. Tiny handprints covered the walls, pressed deep into the stone as if made by living flesh.
There was metals inside this hidden chamber. Gold, silver, and other types of metallic objects.
Whatever had happened here was not meant to honor life. It was meant to conceal something the world was never supposed to find.
There's still a lot of things that we are starting to understand about Machu Picchu.
The scan they tried to delete. In 2024, a research group from the Cusco Institute of Archaeology began an advanced digital remapping of Machu Picchu. Their goal was to solve one of the site's most puzzling mysteries. For years, scientists had known that only about 40% of Machu Picchu was visible above ground.
To understand the magnitude of Machu Picchu, we'll have to see it from very high above.
The remaining 60%, hidden beneath layers of stone and soil, had never been fully mapped. The project was intended to produce a detailed three-dimensional model of the underground structures, using a combination of ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR technology. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic waves into the earth to identify cavities or materials below the surface, while LiDAR uses laser pulses from aircraft to measure depth and contour with remarkable precision. For decades, archaeologists and historians had debated whether a system of tunnels existed beneath the Temple of the Sun. Some believed that these tunnels connected to secret ceremonial chambers mentioned in early Spanish accounts. One of those records, written by a chronicler in the 16th century, referred to the stone that breathes. Many modern experts think this phrase described hidden areas that allowed air and water to pass through the mountain, possibly part of a ritual drainage system. These descriptions encouraged the 2024 team to search beneath the temple rather than around it. The radar images soon revealed two separate voids under the structure. The first cavity matched the known purification basins, which were already documented in earlier maps. However, the second cavity appeared much deeper, about 12 meters below the temple floor. Its shape was unusual and almost perfectly oval. The way it reflected the radar pulses suggested that it was not entirely solid. Certain parts of the image produced bright echoes, which often indicate the presence of metal or sealed surfaces. This single discovery immediately changed the focus of the project. The researchers realized that the second void might not be natural at all, but deliberately built. When the team attempted to release their findings to the international research community, the response was swift. Within 48 hours, Peruvian officials halted external access to the data, explaining that the files were incomplete and still undergoing review. The statement referred to incomplete processing, but internal communications later showed that the restriction had another reason. Leaked emails revealed that sections of the scan were labeled restricted cultural content. The classification implied that the discovery touched on sensitive cultural or spiritual ground. In the following months, foreign researchers were blocked from downloading the raw images. However, internal analysis continued under a government-supervised program meant to verify the discovery before any public disclosure. A few members of the original research team later spoke anonymously about what they had seen before access was closed. They confirmed that metallic reflections had been recorded in the lower cavity. Some of these signals were strong enough to suggest the presence of flat metallic plates or objects embedded within the chamber walls. Historians following the case noted that Machu Picchu's entire architecture was built on precise alignment between the heavens and the earth. Every major terrace, temple, and waterway corresponded to a celestial feature such as the sun, the moon, or specific constellations. If this newly discovered void followed the same pattern, it might have served a purpose that was not simply architectural, but symbolic. It could represent a continuation of the Inca idea that sacred structures acted as physical links between the human world and the cosmos. The possibility that a perfectly preserved chamber lay hidden beneath the Temple of the Sun suggested that the builders had left behind a message, or perhaps a boundary, never meant to be crossed. What could be buried beneath a mountain so sacred the Inca called it the navel of the world? The next phase of exploration would reveal why this hidden chamber was never meant to be touched. The sealed chamber that shouldn't exist. The excavation began in early 2025 under the close watch of government officials. Only a small number of experts were allowed on site, and everyone had to pass background checks before joining the operation. The team consisted of archaeologists, engineers, and conservation specialists. They worked from a platform built directly beside the Temple of the Sun, surrounded by dense forest and mist that rolled down from the mountains each morning. Every piece of equipment had to be airlifted in by helicopter because the steep terrain made transport by road impossible. The atmosphere among the crew was tense, but filled with anticipation. Using micro-drilling equipment, the engineers began to bore a narrow shaft through the bedrock to reach the radar target. The drilling was done slowly to avoid vibrations that could damage the fragile Inca stonework. After 4 hours of careful drilling, the team lowered a robotic camera through the hole. The live feed displayed rough stone walls covered with layers of compacted clay. As the probe's light adjusted, everyone in the control tent fell silent. The image revealed a circular cavity that appeared to be intentionally sealed. The surface of the clay was dark gray and streaked with black ash, as if exposed to smoke or fire centuries ago. When samples were taken and tested on site, they contained microscopic fragments of bone mixed into the clay. Archaeologists immediately realized this was not normal construction material. No other Inca site had ever shown evidence of this method. In Inca tradition, sealing an enclosure with ash and bone symbolized a space that had been spiritually contaminated. It was a form of containment meant to keep a powerful force from escaping, rather than to protect something inside. The discovery caused unease among the crew. Several workers stepped back from the viewing monitor, whispering that the air in the tent felt heavier. One of the engineers said that it smelled faintly metallic, though the chamber had not yet been opened. Once permission was granted to extend the probe, a second camera was inserted to penetrate the clay seal. When the camera pushed through, the image flickered for several seconds before stabilizing. What appeared on the screen shocked everyone present. The chamber was larger than expected, about 4 meters wide and 3 meters tall. The walls were smooth and lined with thin vertical streaks of red that ran from the ceiling to the floor. Laboratory tests later confirmed that the residue contained iron and hemoglobin, the chemical components of blood. It had been there for centuries. Near the far wall, 2 partial skeletons were visible. They were positioned awkwardly, their limbs drawn inward as if they had died in extreme pain. The first skeleton's arms were locked tightly to the chest, while the second had its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The skull of one victim had a clean fracture above the left eye socket, suggesting a single heavy impact. Archaeologists compared the remains with those found at the high-altitude site of Lulailaco, where 3 Inca children had been discovered perfectly preserved in 1999. The physical similarities were disturbing. Both showed signs of constriction at the chest and limbs, evidence that they might have been bound tightly before death. As the team studied the chamber further, they noticed a deliberate order to its layout. The 2 bodies were placed opposite each other, facing a small stone basin in the center of the room. The floor sloped slightly toward this basin, allowing any liquid to collect inside. The design implied that some kind of ritual had taken place here. The mixture of clay, ash, and bone around the entrance suggested that once the ceremony ended, the chamber had been permanently sealed. Air samples taken from inside revealed traces of cinnabar, also known as mercury sulfide. This bright red mineral was considered sacred by the Inca and used during funerary rites to preserve mummies. It was also toxic, and ancient priests handled it carefully, believing it connected life and death. The presence of cinnabar confirmed that the chamber was a place associated with death and transition. Cultural historians later explained that the Inca viewed death not as the end of existence, but as a crossing from one world to another. A sealed chamber like this might have been constructed to control that passage. Excellent question, and you're right to pause there. Yes, phrasing it as passage between the living and the spirits does risk hinting too directly at the cosmic or spiritual gateway idea that we're saving for the final revelation. Scholars later concluded that the skeletons were almost certainly ritual participants chosen to serve as guardians of the temple's hidden sanctity. Their positions around the basin matched descriptions from Inca records in which selected individuals were bound and offered as living keys, meant to protect sacred power contained inside a holy enclosure. Their twisted posture might not have been random. Victims were often bound so tightly that tendons tore and bones strained against the ropes. The purpose was to stop the soul from leaving the body before the ceremony was finished. Each one had to remain completely still until the final chant ended, unable to move, unable to scream. When the moment came, a priest struck the fatal blow, and their blood was poured into the basin to complete the offering. Their bodies were left in silence as the chamber filled with smoke, and the priests sealed the entrance behind them. The discovery left the research team shaken. No one spoke about what had happened beneath the Temple of the Sun, yet every person knew they had uncovered something that was never meant to be disturbed. The footage of the bound bodies and the blood-stained basin raised a question that none of them could answer. What were the Inca trying to keep contained within that chamber, and why did they seal it so completely? In the following weeks, the focus shifted from the remains to the structure itself. The archaeologists decided to rescan the interior of the chamber, using advanced optical imaging to detect any hidden engravings. What they found next changed everything. The excavation team sealed the entry shaft once more and returned to the control tent. No one spoke about what had happened beneath the Temple of the Sun, yet every person knew they had uncovered something that was never meant to be disturbed. The footage of the bound bodies and the blood-stained basin raised a question that none of them could answer. What were the Inca trying to keep contained within that chamber, and why did they seal it so completely? In the following weeks, the focus shifted from the remains to the structure itself. The archaeologists decided to rescan the interior of the chamber, using advanced optical imaging to detect any hidden engravings. What they found next changed everything. The floor beneath the skeletons was not smooth. It was covered with markings that had been invisible for centuries. The forbidden symbols on the floor. When the sealed chamber was scanned in full-spectrum light, the sensors revealed faint carvings spread across the stone floor. They could not be seen with the naked eye, but under infrared, they glowed in a dull red pattern that traced outward from the basin in the center. The shapes were not random scratches. Each line was deliberate and deeply cut into the rock. As the digital image sharpened, the design became clear. It formed an 8-point spiral that radiated from a star-like symbol at its heart. The central shape matched the Pleiades constellation, which the Inca called Colca, meaning the celestial storehouse. The Pleiades were sacred to the Inca. They appeared in the night sky in June, marking the start of the new agricultural year. Priests would climb to mountain summits and watch for their first appearance to decide when to plant crops and when to begin festivals, honoring the gods of fertility and rain. To the Inca, these stars also represented the border between life and death. They believed that the spirits of the dead traveled to the stars and returned through them to watch over the living. The discovery of the Pleiades symbol inside a sealed death chamber shocked the team. It implied that whoever built this room had connected death itself with the heavens above. Archaeologists compared the spiral pattern with other sacred sites across Peru. They found almost identical symbols carved into platforms at Choqquequirao and Nazca, both associated with large-scale religious ceremonies. This connection suggested that Machu Picchu was part of a wider ritual network, one that used geometry and astronomy to unite distant temples. The spiral on the chamber floor could have been a diagram of that network, showing the route the spirit was believed to travel after sacrifice. Along one wall, the camera picked up the faint outline of a small stone plate. On it was a carved figure curled tightly into a fetal position. Tiny droplets surrounded the figure. When enlarged, the carving resembled a person returning to the womb. Historians interpreted this as a symbol of rebirth through offering. It represented the belief that death, when performed in ceremony, was not an end, but a return to creation. Residue scraped from the carvings contained traces of burnt maize and animal fat. These substances were common in Inca rituals during the Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. During that festival, priests burned offerings to honor the sun god, Inti, and to call back the spirits of their ancestors. The presence of those same materials in the sealed chamber proved that this underground ritual followed the same sacred principles, only on a much darker level. It suggested that the priests had recreated the ceremony in a hidden place where light never reached, as if they believed the most powerful offerings had to be made in complete darkness. Experts began to suspect that these carvings were not only decorative, but functional. They might have been used to channel sound, water, or light in specific directions during ceremonies. Some researchers proposed that the spiral acted as a kind of ritual guide, directing the flow of energy or prayer from the center of the chamber toward the mountains. Others believed it was designed to connect different elements of the temple's ritual system, linking water, sound, and light to create a powerful ceremonial effect. Whatever its true function was, it clearly reflected knowledge and planning far beyond what anyone expected to find in a hidden underground room. When the team measured the direction of these carvings and the way the chamber was constructed, they discovered that this spiral was not only symbolic, it was perfectly aligned with something far away, something chillingly precise. This finding forced the researchers to reopen their investigation and examine the data from the radar scans again. That was when they noticed a second, deeper void beneath the chamber. The team called it the second room, and what they found next would shake every assumption ever made about Machu Picchu. the second room's alignment that no one can explain. When the team began to measure the lower chamber's orientation, the readings were too exact to be accidental. The laser theodolites showed that the main axis of the second room aligned perfectly with the sunrise on June 21st, the winter solstice. This was the most sacred day in the Inca calendar, marking the rebirth of the sun god, Inti. At first, the team believed this was simply a ritual orientation used for ceremonies, but a secondary reading changed everything. The back wall of the chamber pointed directly toward Mount Lulaialaco, a mountain known for the most famous discovery of Inca child sacrifices. When they extended the same alignment line across a map of the Andes, it passed through two more ritual sites, Aconcagua and Vilcashuaman, both used for offerings to the gods. This was not coincidence. The Inca had built a geometric network of sacred sites connected through light and distance, forming what researchers began calling a line of sacrifice. To test the alignment, the archaeologists brought in a narrow beam light projector to recreate the path of the solstice sunrise. When they shone the beam through the entrance of the second room, the light cut across the floor like a blade and stopped exactly on the far wall that faced Lulaialaco. As the beam brightened, faint shapes began to appear on the surface of the wall. At first, they looked like patches of discoloration, but as the image sharpened, the room filled with silence. Dozens of small hand imprints emerged on the stone. They were arranged in a row, pressed deep into the surface as if made by soft flesh rather than tools. The size of the hands left no doubt. They belonged to children. The archaeologists were stunned. Each handprint was spaced evenly apart, following the same solstice line as if the children had been made to stand there together, facing the mountain. The impressions were so precise that individual fingerprints could still be seen along the edges. Samples were taken from inside the prints, and under the microscope, they revealed traces of collagen and calcium phosphate, substances found in human bone. The hands had not been carved. They had been pressed directly into the stone while it was still warm and malleable, likely from heating during a ritual fire. The team's shock grew when they realized the prints were positioned to catch the first light of the rising sun. When the beam was aligned exactly with the solstice angle, the light passed over each hand one by one, illuminating them in sequence from left to right. This created the effect of the children reaching toward the light together. The light then stopped on a central mark shaped like a small open palm. The alignment was so precise that even the slightest movement of the projector broke the sequence completely. Historians explained that in Inca religion, children chosen for the Capacocha sacrifice were believed to be pure enough to carry the prayers of the empire to the gods. The act of pressing their hands into the wall might have been the final step before the offering. It allowed them to touch the sacred surface that connected the mountain to the sky. In that moment, the victims would have believed they were being transformed into messengers for the gods. After their hands were pressed into the stone, the ritual would have continued with offerings of food, drink, and prayer. The priests would then have given the children a strong maize-based drink called chicha to make them drowsy. When they lost consciousness, the priests either suffocated them gently or left them to die peacefully inside the chamber. Once the ceremony was finished, the priests sealed the chamber. The air inside was dry and still, preserving the organic residue in the handprints. The bodies might have been removed before sealing, but the markings were left as eternal evidence of the act. When the scientists switched from visible light to infrared, the room became even more horrifying. The handprints began to glow faintly, one after another, as if reacting to the simulated sunrise. The organic residue within the stone absorbed the light, producing a dim red outline that made the wall look alive. The effect was so realistic that one technician turned away, saying it looked as though the children were still trapped inside the stone, trying to reach for help. The discovery of the children's handprints in the second room led the team to believe that the chamber might have been part of a larger ritual system. But if the chamber was built to connect sacrifice with the movements of the sun and the stars, what really took place inside it? The next discovery would give that question a horrifyingly physical answer. The bloodline and the echo. To understand how it worked, the team began collecting samples from the stone floor and from the thin channels that ran underneath it. The channels had been cut directly into the bedrock and were narrow, about the width of a finger. At first glance, they seemed like drains, but their perfect straightness suggested they had been made with a specific purpose. The samples were taken to a portable laboratory at the site, where chemical tests were run for organic materials. The results were shocking. The deposits inside the stone contained high levels of iron, copper, and degraded DNA. These elements are found in human blood. There was no doubt that blood had once flowed through the channels. The finding matched what Inca records described about the most sacred rituals of the empire. During times of drought or famine, priests performed sacrifices to restore balance between the people and the gods. They believed that blood carried the life force that kept the world alive. Returning it to the earth was not an act of cruelty in their view, but one of duty. The blood of the chosen victims was considered a message to the divine, a way of asking for forgiveness or protection. The channels in the chamber had been built to guide that blood in a precise direction, following the same alignment as the sunrise and the mountain of Lulailico. To test how the channels might have functioned, the engineers filled a small section with harmless fluorescent water. They wanted to see if the liquid would move in the same way that blood might have during the ceremony. When the pump started, the water flowed slowly across the floor and disappeared into a crack near the far wall. The equipment used to monitor the flow began to register faint vibrations. The noise was so soft at first that it could barely be heard, but as the liquid reached the end of the line, the vibration grew stronger. The entire chamber began to hum. The sound had no clear source. It was not coming from the machinery. It was coming from the stone itself. The team froze. The vibration was steady, like a heartbeat. It lasted for several seconds, then faded, then returned each time the water moved through the channels. The engineers checked the instruments and confirmed that the vibration measured about 19 hertz. That frequency is too low for most people to hear clearly, but it can be felt through the body. It creates a heavy feeling in the chest and a sense of unease. Some of the researchers stepped back, saying they felt dizzy. The archaeologists realized that the sound was traveling along the same alignment line that connected the chamber to the sacred mountains. The structure seemed to react to the flow of liquid as though it had been built to respond. Acoustic specialists examined the readings and confirmed that the vibration was real. It was not random movement or mechanical interference. The data showed that the stone had been shaped in a way that allowed sound to move through it like a wave. This meant the chamber could have been designed to carry vibrations deep into the mountain. The priests might have believed that when the liquid flowed and the mountain trembled, the gods could hear them. The mixture of blood and sound would have been a way to combine two forms of offering, physical and spiritual, in the same moment. When the test ended, the humming did not stop immediately. It continued for almost a minute after the pumps were turned off, a low pulse rising from beneath the floor. The researchers stood in silence, listening to it fade. One of them described it as the mountain breathing. Another said it sounded like a voice trying to speak through stone. The experience left everyone shaken. They knew they had disturbed something that had been silent for hundreds of years. The experiment proved that the chamber was not only a place for ritual sacrifice, but a structure built with purpose. Every drop of blood and every sound that passed through that space had been part of a ritual that linked the living world with something far beyond it. The strange vibration and the movement of light inside the chamber led the researchers to rescan the walls for any signs of writing or carvings that could explain what they had found. What they uncovered next was a message hidden in the stone itself that revealed the true meaning behind the second room. The true intention. When the researchers studied every piece of data together, the meaning of the second room became clear. The carvings, the handprints, the channels, and the alignment of the walls were not separate features. They were all parts of a single plan. The builders had created a system that joined light, sound, and movement in one process. It was not a coincidence. It was a machine built for worship. The Inca priests who designed the chamber believed that every living thing existed because the gods allowed it. To them, life was a loan that had to be paid back. They saw blood, breath, and sound as the only forms of payment the gods would accept. Every section of the chamber was made to direct those offerings in a precise way. Blood was meant to flow through the stone channels, sound was meant to move through the walls, and light from the solstice sunrise was meant to strike the same points each year. The design turned sacrifice into a repeatable system. The priests believed that when all three forces met, the mountain would be fed and the gods would be satisfied. In their eyes, this was how they kept the world alive. The rituals inside the second room were acts that required human life. The evidence showed that the victims, including children, were forced to take part in these ceremonies. Those children were taken from their families, prepared for months, and then led into the dark chamber beneath the temple. The priests told them they were serving the empire and that the gods would reward them. Their hands were pressed into the heated stone to mark their presence. Their blood flowed into the carved channels, and their bodies became part of the offering. The priests believed these deaths would bring rain, harvest, and peace. The truth is that they brought only silence and loss. Dark stories from surviving oral traditions tell what happened to women who tried to stop these sacrifices. Mothers who begged for their children were dragged into the streets and punished in front of others. Some were stripped and paraded through their villages as warnings. Others were beaten until they could no longer stand, left lying in the dirt as the crowd watched in fear. In rare cases, they were taken to nearby rivers and thrown into the water, their bodies carried away to show that no one could resist the will of the priests. These women were not rebels or criminals. They were mothers trying to save their children. Their pain was used to frighten others into obedience. Each act of punishment made the next sacrifice easier to demand, until even grief itself became part of the ritual.